Peeps! Welcome to our second lecture and the first one about American history. This is a significantly longer lecture with a lot of stuff in it, and I am going to endeavor to not talk too much and make this last forever. But nonetheless, it's going to be what it's going to be. When I used to give these lectures in class, this one took about an hour and a half. So we'll see how we do here. I don't know yet. Haven't recorded it. Anyway, here's the trick with American history. History is the study of the written word. So archaeology and anthropology, those people get to study the pre-written word. And so for American historians, this creates a problem because the indigenous Americans didn't have the written word. This is not to say they were stupid or uncivilized. They didn't have writing because they didn't need it because they didn't have private property. It's a long story. You just have to believe me. They had developed oral cultures, lots of independent small cultures instead of megalith, monotheistic European Christian cultures. And because they didn't have the written words, there's a lot of good things that came out of the written word. But nonetheless, so if we start American history with the written word, we have to start with when the Europeans, the white people, get here. And that feels a little, I don't know, racist to me. And also it erases the Americans who were the real Americans, the people who had been here for tens of thousands of years before European colonists, European imperialism. So we can't do that. We can't just start with the white people. But we can't go back too far because this is not an anthropology or archaeology class. So then the question is, where do we begin? And I think we begin kind of at what I call contact, sort of what is the condition of these two? It's one world, it's the New World. And keep in mind, New World is in of itself a Eurocentric way to think about it. North America is only the New World insofar as we look at that from a European perspective. It's not new to the millions of people who had lived here for tens of thousands of years, right? So even New World is troubling. North America is probably a better way to talk about it. Anyway, so the Europeans get here and they engage in conquest, imperialism, colonialism, conquest by violence. But a lot of times when we talk about these, if you go back to A where it says the D word and the E word, Peg, what are you doing? What are you doing, Peg? A lot of times when we talk about this conquest by violence, we use the D word, the D word, discovery. You know, Columbus discovered America. No, he did not. Millions of people lived here. Two, he didn't discover America. He discovered a Caribbean island, which is a part of the Americas, but nonetheless, he didn't discover it. You can't discover a thing. It'd be like when I moved to California 30 years ago and I came down the 15 and I saw Los Angeles spread out and I said, look, I have discovered Los Angeles. No, bitch. You just realized it was here, right? Yeah. Anyway, and then the other word, the E word is the explorers. There's these explorers. But here's the reality. Europeans didn't go out exploring because they were curious, because they wanted to have a nature documentary where they showed us the cool and exotic animals of North America. No. They came here looking for riches. They came here looking for gold. They came here looking for new places to plant, people to farm. They came here looking for people to enslave. But they came here for economic reasons. It's not exploration in the sense that we use it. These are trips of imperialism and colonialism that with the goal is conquest and to both rape and pillage. Yeah, because conquest is always about sexual violence too. Let's not fool ourselves. In the end of that, what we're often left with in American history is this notion that the Europeans won and the native people lost. And certainly, if you want to think that way, that is the way it looks. Here we are, all these white people in charge of all this stuff, and the indigenous people, what are left, live in small island groups. I don't mean on islands, but small groups that function as islands around the country. Be that as it may, we'll get to some of that. But it does give the appearance that the Europeans won and the natives lost, and what history and really Western culture thinks, because again, we think in binaries, right? Black, white, orange, black, apple, orange, black. That's a Halloween binary. Anyway, um, um, that there's winners, that things have to be won or lost, and that there's no middle ground or no just skipping the whole concept. And and that one of the things deeply ingrained in our society is this notion that winners are superior. Indeed, we use you are good, you are excellent. We'll say you're a winner, and that losers are inferior. So what history does, sometimes explicitly and more time implicitly, that is, implies that the white people were superior, that they won because they were better, and then the other side of that binary coin is the native people, the not white people, here it begins, were inferior. We're not as good. We're subhuman. Ew. Ick. Well, let's examine all of that a little more closely. Next slide. Uh, Here's the thing we can start with, that indigenous people, Native Americans, Indians, and I have some friends who are Indians, that is indigenous North American people, not people from India, though I have those friends too. They don't mind Indian, at least the people I know. But anyway, we're going to say indigenous people mostly here. Indigenous people and European Americans were very, very different. And you can see in this picture, it's surely the clothing is different, but it's so much more complicated than that. What we're going to examine, this could be a whole class in and of itself, right? This could be 15 weeks of the ways in which indigenous people and European Americans are very different. But we're going to do religion, family structure, and gender role differences. And then there is everything else. There's their food, their clothing, their living style, their approach to the environment. There's all that stuff. But we're going to really focus on the three A, B, C, and D there. Yeah? Cool. Okay, let's go do that with the next slide. Okay, first difference, at least for us in this lecture, uh, Native American, Native North Americans and Europeans were very different with regards to religion. Very, very different. Let's go down the list. North Americans, Native North Americans were polytheistic. This means they had many gods and goddesses. Indeed, they would have had obviously different words for it because they didn't speak English, and their words wouldn't have differentiated gender. God and goddess is our Western need to suggest that that gods have gender, and indeed we know that for both Europeans and Native North Americans, they did understand their deities, their divine entities, as being either male or female, or sometimes even animals. See goddesses, see the word goddesses. Some, indeed many of indigenous tribes, gods were female. Here, it's worth pointing out that everything I'm saying here in this lecture about Native Americans is huge generalizations. There were, historians think, about 2,000 culturally specific or different tribal groups in North America at the time that Europeans arrived here. And that spread all over the country in different places, with different religious traditions, sometimes related, like tribes that lived near each other. Say the Hopi and the Navajo had very religious systems that were alike, probably because they had some cross-cultural dissemination there. But we do know when we talk about all these things, or these are things old 2,000 of these groups pretty much had in common. But again, stuff we're talking about vast generalizations about both the indigenous North Americans and the Europeans. Because Europeans, we're going to talk about the Spanish, the English, the French, even there are some Russians. Those are very different groups of people, and yet they have these things in common. Okay? Anyway, back to goddesses. They had goddesses. Corn Mother is an example. In next slide, I've got a picture of a bunch of goddesses I can talk about briefly. In my women's history class, we spend a fair bit of time on goddesses, and students really, really like it. But it's not our mission here today. You could Google that shit. Yeah, some of their gods were animals. I got a couple of those on the next slide. So the point is they had many gods, and they weren't all dudes. They weren't all white guys in the sky. And if that's your guy, if that's your dude, that's fine. Not criticizing you. It's not my dude. I am a pagan. I'm a witch actually. But I'm cool. I think it's good that we believe in something. But if you're an atheist, that's cool too. My husband's an atheist. I don't understand it, but it's cool. Anyway, so there's the 2,000 religious variants. So the point is that their religious deities weren't gender specific. It wasn't like if you suggest to a European Christian or even a modern American Christian that God might be female, a lot of them would come vaguely unglued. Indeed, I've had students be deeply offended at this notion that God uh, might not be male, but they'll also be deeply offended when I say that Christianity is patriarchal, which is weird, if you ask me, but nonetheless. Okay. By the way, if you're inclined to complain about that, know that that complaint has already been taken to my department head, and she has dismissed it, saying she lectures the very same things, because it is true. In Christianity, the deity is considered male, and the religion is deeply, deeply patriarchal, as it says over here on the list on the right. Okay, so Europeans had monotheistic religion. Indeed, the Europeans who came here were almost all Protestants, some Catholics. But here's the thing: those are all Christians. I know a lot of Protestants think Catholics aren't Christians, but they are. They're the original Christians before the Protestants in the 1500s, after 1,500 years of Christianity as Catholicism. The Protestants, some people split off. The Protestants, um, and developed Protestantism, and then all the sub-religions of that, right? The Lutherans, the Methodists, the Baptists, etc. Anyway, I would think if you are a Protestant, you should know what your religion is, and you should know that the Catholics are the original Christians. So here's the thing: though Christianity, be it Protestant or Catholic, it's monotheistic. You got one God, and really one religion, because don't get a lot of Jewish or Muslim colonizers in the period of colonization and imperialism. When we start to get those kinds of people with those religions in America, they come as disempowered immigrants, and that's a very different thing. In Christianity, God is considered male. The priests and all of God's religious authorities are all male. There's very little space for women in Christianity. There's Eve, but she's a naughty temptress. There's a little bit of Lilith. That's Adam's first wife. She's apparently super naughty. And then there's some female saints who are all revered for being good, subservient women who knew their place. Which is, another thing, whatever. That's your gig. Knock yourself out. Thus, Christianity is a patriarchal religion. It is a religion that, in the same time, empowers men and disempowers women. It does, and that makes you uncomfortable. I'm sorry about that. And I know a lot of Christian sects. I recently went to a funeral of a friend of mine's lesbian friend. So it was very tangential, but it was a female Episcopal priest who conducted the service. But the occasional female Episcopal priest does not make the whole religion not patriarchal. Yeah, it also doesn't make it bad. Patriarchy isn't in and of itself bad. So let's all just relax. Okay? Next slide. Let's stop talking about this. It makes me uncomfortable. Next slide. I have nothing to write down here. I just wanted to show you some images of non-male divine figures, gods, goddesses, whatever you want to call them. We have there in the upper left-hand corner, that's Raven. There's a bunch of Native American tribal people who had a kind of a raven god. The raven is often a trickster. It's not that he's bad. Most Native American religions don't think about religion in terms of good and bad, right? God, Satan, heaven, hell. It's not binary. It's one of the products of polytheistic religions. Religions with lots of gods is, instead of having two things, God and Satan, you have many things, and then that in and of itself erases binaryism. Next to Raven there, with the swirl, that is the Inuit, Eskimo is the common word, goddess Sedna. She's a goddess of the sea. You see the orcas and seals and walruses in her hair? Yeah. Next to her, with the buffalo, or more appropriately bison behind her, that's White Buffalo Calf Woman. She is a goddess of the Sioux people. She is a maiden goddess of spring and rebirth. Down here in the left-hand quarter is Spider Woman. She is a crone goddess. She is a god of age and wisdom and power. She sometimes appears as a spider. Um, you see the web of the universe there. In the middle on the bottom, that is Corn Mother. You've got three kinds of goddesses: maiden, mother, crone. Maiden goddesses, that sort of spring rebirth things. Mother goddesses, nurturing, growth, and then crone goddesses, old women, wisdom, power. You get it. Maiden, mother, crone. So Buffalo Calf Woman is a maiden goddess, Spider Woman is a crone goddess, and Corn Mother is, by her very name, a mother goddess. And then there is Coyote. I think Coyote has a raven there on his staff. You would often see Coyote and Raven together because they're both trickster gods, gods who play tricks on people. Not really bad, but troublesome, meddlesome, gods that you could you would think when things were going badly, Coyote or Raven are playing a part in this here. But anyway, there's many, many more. If you were interested at all in this kind of thing, that would be an easy Google search. But if not, we can just move on, right? Next slide. Indigenous people and European colonizers also arranged their families very differently. If we look over there under North American indigenous people, almost all of the 2,000 tribal groups at contact time, it shifted after contact as the world changed, but at contact time were matriarchal. That is, they had woman-headed families. Now, most of these tribal people also had tribal leaders that were often male. Um, so the power, it's not about, I need you to not think about this matriarchy, patriarchy thing as matriarchy is women have all the power and men are oppressed, and in patriarchy, men have all the power and women are oppressed. It is certain that in patriarchy, there's a vast difference in power, and that men have an unequal amount of the power, and women are to my mind, inappropriately oppressed. Matriarchy functions in most places not as the opposite of that, but rather as a more of a power sharing system. So what you would have in indigenous tribal groups, you would have women at the head of households, but men usually in charge of the tribal government, and then those two groups could collaborate in direction. Most of our Native American family groups or tribal groups were also matrilineal, that is, naming and family follow the female line. This makes perfectly good sense if you consider super realistically how new human beings are made. Women make them. Our bodies make them. We make them. We feed them with our bodies. We get small people to adulthood with our bodies and our minds and our hands and et cetera, et cetera. Until we understand DNA and the biological nature of reproduction, paternity is essentially a myth. And really, even if you do understand DNA and how sperms and eggs work, you have to admit, dudes, and really chicks, that men's role in that is extremely tiny. You have an orgasm, there's a sperm, and then really, guys, your job is done. And then women make human beings. It makes sense that in that system where women make the human beings, that the human beings would be named after and would belong to the woman's family. A world in which women have to take men's names and babies get the man's name can only be a patriarchal world that takes the thing that women do, make new human beings, and says that actually has no value. It's ridiculous. But that's patriarchy, okay? So what we have over here with indigenous people is we have a matriarchy where women are in charge of the family. Makes sense. They make the human beings. It's matrilineal. So in a matrilineal society, my kid, I only have the one, her last name would be Lamphere. It's not. Her last name is Burke. I will be honest. My husband volunteered to have her be a Lamphere, but I thought it would enrage his parents. Oh my God. They never liked that I didn't change my name. So I just didn't want her. Also, Burke is easier to spell than Lamphere. So anyway, I assume that most of your last names are your dad's last names. Maybe not all, though. So the North American indigenous peoples' family systems were systems of fundamental gender equality, not just reverse patriarchy. It's that stuff I already said. Whereas over with the Europeans, their families are patriarchal, just like the religions, the government, everything else. The families are headed by males. Descent is patrilineal, follows the male line. And underwriting this all is this legal principle that you find in all of the European nations by about 1000. So 1400 years ago, this notion of coverture or femme covert, which is Latin for woman covered, it is a legal principle that men own their daughters and their wives. It's why in marriage ceremony, you are traditionally a woman is walked down the aisle by her father, who then symbolically hands her over to her husband. This signals the shift in ownership from father to husband. And until the 1970s, for those of you who think, oh, feminists, what have they done for us? If only you knew. Until the 70s, women couldn't legally take out a loan, which means they couldn't get a car loan, they couldn't get a mortgage, they couldn't start their own business, they couldn't even have a credit card. They couldn't divorce by their own. They had to wait to be divorced by men. They couldn't serve on a jury of their peers. So if you were a rape victim, your jury was all men. Imagine how that went. Etc., etc. That societies that exist under the principle of coverture, where women are legally owned by men, women have very few legal powers. And I think we're seeing some return to that in this spreading notion in America that men should control women's bodies. And if you're for that, I don't know what to say to you except Goddess have mercy on your soul, because that's not cool. That is a kind of slavery, and I'm just going to say it. It's not cool. And if that bugs you, it's not too late to drop the class. Next slide. Okay, what you could guess then is that because their families are organized very differently, their notions of gender roles are very different. Who has power? Who shouldn't have power? And again, what you see with indigenous North Americans is sort of this notion that power should be shared, whereas in Europeans, a notion that power belongs to men. Oh, all right, which is all stuff I've said. And you might, then the question here, and I think it's up here in the yellow, yes it is, why? Why female power? What's wrong with these Native Americans that they let the bitches have some power? Oh no. The reality is that in pre-industrial societies, women create all of the human beings and 75% of the food through gathering and farming. This is often a surprise to students because when we talk about pre-industrial societies, we often talk about hunting and hunter-gatherers or just farming. Lots of Native American tribes farm, but I will say that we mostly think, when we think about them in an ill-informed and poorly educated way, we don't think about them as farmers. But lots and lots of tribal people were farmers. And it turns out that women in these societies did the farming, and they did the food gathering, depending on what kind of society they were. And it turns out that the kind of stuff that you can either gather or grow, the vegetable matter and the grain matter, right? Acorns or corn, if you're gathering or growing vegetables that you pluck from nature or grow yourself. All of that stuff, all that non-meat stuff, made up 75 to sometimes 90% of indigenous people's diets, in much the way that they should still make up that much of our diets now. I mean, one of the reasons we're so fat and so sick in America is because we eat too much processed food and way, way, way too much meat. So the notion was that women were in charge of the vast majority of the food. Men were in charge of hunting, and it turns out in almost all indigenous societies it worked that way. Men were in charge of the hunting, women were in charge of the agriculture, whether that was gathering or farming. And that's because women make human beings, and it is hard to go hunting, particularly if you have to go out for a number of days or weeks and be gone for a long time, and to be quiet when you're sneaking up on that bison or that rabbit. Be quiet when you've got small people with you who are incapable of being quiet, as anybody with toddlers in the house knows. So that not only did women make the human beings, but they made much of the food. That's where they get all of this cultural power. Um, and if you're thinking, well, it sounds like you're being mean to men. I'm reporting the news. I'm not making it up. And two, well, men made somewhere between 10 and 25% of the tribal group's calories. Those are very important calories too. I'm not dismissing the importance of hunted protein. Um, one, meat is delicious, unless you're a vegan or vegetarian. Then I'm sorry I said that out loud to you. My daughter would be appalled. Um, but it's also like protein is crucial to human development too. And you can live as a vegetarian. You can. I know you can. I got a daughter who's a vegetarian. Um, you can live as a vegan too. I don't know why you'd want to, but I've heard people do it. I couldn't give up cheese. I could give up eggs, but not cheese. Um, I'm a cheesemaker, in case you were wondering. Yeah, I make cheese. Anyway, back to the thing. So there you go. And then indigenous North Americans had no private land ownership. So it wasn't like you own this and we own this. That isn't to say that, like, say, the Sioux people or the Blackfoot people, the Navajo people didn't have a sense that this is our territory, this is our land, but there's no private ownership of it, right, with where records are written and down. Because Native Americans don't think of land as something you can own. They don't think you can own it any more than we think you could own air. Unless, of course, you live in Tokyo or New York City, where apparently people are selling air rights. But nonetheless, and so it doesn't occur to them, if you don't own land, you don't have to invent writing to keep track of who owns what. See, so without any private ownership, you don't have any writing, and that's how we get to this. These people didn't have writing. They didn't need it. And that would, if you think about it, that'd be a world where you didn't have to take notes. That would be fantastic. Um, these two realities that women created all the humans and made much of the food, and there was no private land ownership, created a world where women had some power, where power was shared between people and not thought of as a thing that belonged to any one group or the other, and probably not a thing that would belong to. They probably didn't even divide people up that way. You didn't need to divide groups into women and men without patriarchy and misogyny and sexism. You don't have to create a group of others called women and then make them different and other and inferior. You see what I mean? Yeah. Europeans, on the other hand, women still make the humans and they still do lots of the farming, but what happens is Europeans, going way back to ancient Sumeria, develop a private land ownership, and then they decide, for reasons that are complicated and beyond the scope of this lecture, that men own that land. And so they develop writing to keep track of which man owns which piece of land, and then which men own which women, and then having developed that writing, they can use that writing to invent a religion that they can write in a book and spread around Europe that says that men are gods and men have power and women do not. And then all of that, women become unwaged, devalued workers. It's not that they don't work, because they do, because child work, farming, food making, all that stuff is work, but they're unwaged, and what they do is devalued. And I would argue that's still true today, that you can pretend all you want that we value the domestic work of housekeeping, food making, and child rearing, but we don't. We don't. We just don't. Again, I'm not saying it's unimportant. I think it's immensely important. I think the most important thing I have done in my life was not my PhD or my books or my teaching. It was raising my daughter, who's an empathetic and moral and decent human being. That was my most important work. But society doesn't value that. So in the European societies, the power lies mostly with the men. Again, patriarchy. Yeah? Okay. Cool. Next slide. Okay, short one here. It just occurred to me I'd done a lot of talking and didn't have a lot of pictures for you. And I went looking for something, and I found this. And I thought it was super interesting. This is Native American land use in 2020 as compared to non-Native American land use. That is, who owns the farms? Um, and I think two things are surprising about this. One, still today in 2020, after 500 years of European colonization and white supremacy, in Native American communities, women still own essentially 50% of the land. and men own 50%. So they're still half and half. That's pretty interesting. I also think it's interesting. If you'd have asked me in the rest of America what the percentage was, I would have thought women owned as little as 10 to 15% of the land. I wouldn't have said that we owned 33%. So 33.37%, that's just about a third. Um, that's 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 a surprising number to me. It's still less than half. And here's the thing: women make up slightly more than half of the population, about 51%, because we're constitutionally stronger, we live longer, and we die less of disease than men. So, in a fair and just world, we should own 50% of everything. We should be 50% of all the power structures. And we don't. But I got to tell you, I'm still surprised by that number. I'm just surprised by both of them. That after 500 years of colonization, Native American women are still have more equality than non-Native women, and that 33% of farmland in America is owned by women is interesting to me. Yeah. All right. Next slide. You don't have to write any of that down. I should have told you that right away. That's just interesting to me. And I thought, fun little extra. Okay, back to the work. Okay, so we're at the midpoint of the lecture where if we had been in a classroom, I'd give you guys a 5, 6, 7 minute break to go pee and get a drink of water. But feel free. You can stop these lectures anytime you want. Nonetheless, what's the point of this first half? The point is that, I'm sure you've gotten by now, indigenous Native American cultures and European colonists were very, very, very different. That it appears that the Europeans won the contact and colonization wars, so it's easy to think the Europeans must have been superior. So all this patriarchy and this men are in charge of stuff, that must be the way to go because those are the people that won. And again, and we haven't really covered this in the lecture, but it's sort of going to be the culminating point of this. We're going to do some more stuff. We're going to come back to this point that certainly our history books tell us that when white people win because white people are better. That patriarchy is superior, that keeping your women in check is superior, that essentially racism and sexism are good. And I think we can all agree, even the conservatives among us, that is white supremacist and sexist nonsense. So let's go forward and let's see if it's not true that Europeans won. I think that's true. But I'm saying winning doesn't mean you're better. So if that's true, why did they win? And what does it mean? Let's go do that in the second half of the lecture. Yeah? And at this point, really, if you feel like taking a little break, getting up and wandering around a little bit, not a terrible idea, because it's hard to concentrate for long, sustained points of time. I certainly don't record these all in one go. And I've done these lectures more than once, and I have pretty sustained concentration abilities. So feel free to take a break if you need one and come back. Okay? Anyway, I'll go on to the next slide, and I'll see you when you get there. Here's where we're going to do something that most history textbooks and classes probably don't do. You've probably heard, oh yeah, Native Americans died of disease. But then, generally, and then we go on to talk about the conquest and the horses and the guns and all the implied white supremacy notions. And I'm here to tell you it's not the horses and guns. 13 minutes after Europeans showed up with horses and guns, the Native Americans stole them and had horses and guns too. They weren't stupid. Being brown doesn't make you stupid, as many of you know. So it had to have been something else, and it turns out it's disease, or more specifically, disease mortality. And as we go on, let me tell you this. In my first college degree was in microbiology. That's right. I got a college degree in microbiology, and I thought, I hate this. And so then I got a second degree in history, and then that's where I got my PhD, and here I am today. But nonetheless, my first degree was in microbiology. My dad ran the state lab in Montana, and he very much wanted me to join him at the state lab, and maybe even, I suppose, take over after him. But I couldn't do it. Anyway, here's the interesting thing, and I sincerely mean this. The New World had no mortal pathogens. So mortal means dying, having death, and pathogen is a disease-causing agent. So a bacteria or a virus. So they had no diseases that routinely killed people that were caused by bacteria or viruses, no pathogen diseases. I'm not saying they didn't have cancer, though they probably didn't have much because they didn't have all the gross stuff in their environments that we have, all the chemicals, all the processed food, all that crap so many of you eat. Um, I'm not saying they didn't have diabetes, but probably not much because, again, that's very much a modernity disease caused by overeating and bad eating. And so anyway, they had that stuff, but they didn't have any diseases that we get vaccinated against. Those didn't exist in the New World. It's not that Native American people were resistant to them. They didn't exist. That for some weird, bizarre reason, when people came across the land bridge, something like up on the Bering Straits where Alaska and Russia there used to be a bridge of land that met that. The seas used to be about 400 feet lower than 40,000 years ago. The seas were about 400 feet lower. There was a land bridge there. People came across it, and for some reason, when they got over here, they didn't bring any of the diseases with them. And there's a bunch of theories about why that is. And the immunological historians are still arguing about that, and I don't know why. There's some argument to be made that people who could make it that far were people who weren't sick. But they wouldn't have come in one trip. They'd have come in, 50, 200-mile increments over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, there's a good argument to be made that it took about 2,000 years for people to get from Alaska to, say, where we are now in Los Angeles. Not that it took them 2,000 years, because you could canoe that far in less than 2,000 years, or kayak, I guess. But just in terms of human habitation. Also, there was a great big, essentially ice field in the middle, sort of where Lower Canada, Montana are now, that people couldn't cross. Anyway, we don't know why, but no disease pathogens here. So because they didn't have any of the diseases, they didn't have any immunity to them. Why would they? You can't have an influenza immunity if you don't have influenza. On the other hand, the Old World, and again, keep in mind that New World, Old World is a very colonialist, imperialist way of talking about it. It's shorthand for me. But Europe, Africa, Asia is the Old World. It's easier to say Old World than Europe, Africa, Asia. And the New World, North, Central, and South America. It's shorthand, keeping in mind the New World isn't new to the millions of people who lived here before Europeans showed up. Right? Right. Okay. But the Old World was seething in mortal pathogens, just seething in them. All those things we have now, all those things that we immunize against, the Old World was awash in. All the poxes, chicken pox, smallpox, cowpox, all the influenzas, and like the recent pandemic caused by coronavirus. Coronavirus is a variety of flu virus. And indeed, the common cold is a coronavirus. So they're all related. No smallpox, no whooping cough, no diphtheria, no. We don't see much of that anymore. Measles, though there's been a recurrence because of the profoundly stupid anti-vaxxers among us in the society. And if you are an anti-vaxxer and I just called you profoundly stupid, again, you're going to have to just live with that, because it is. There's lots of good science about vaccines. And science is real. Anyway, so you can already kind of imagine, what would happen when people who come from a place full of those diseases come to a place where people had none of those diseases. It would be kind of like when the coronavirus, the pandemic virus, first came in late 2019 to America in early 2020, and then swept through places like New York City, and eventually got to Los Angeles and just killed in that first wave. I should look this up, but it's well over 600,000 Americans. A plague made worse by the mismanagement of the ex-president, current rapist. But nonetheless, and we live in a world where we've been vaccinated against a bunch of stuff, and we have you've all had the flu. And so even though that coronavirus that came in 2019, 2020 was not the common flu, it was a relative of that, and we had some immunity to that. Now imagine what that disease could have done to populations that had no immunities to any of the cold and flu viruses. I think you can imagine it. Let's play a game and spend some time imagining that in the next slide. Okay, as the kids say, let's game this out. And here, I don't really need you to take any notes here, what I want you to do is to put down your fingers or your pencil, depending on whether you're typing or writing. And I want you to genuinely play along with this. Just do some imagining about this. And having lived through the 2020 pandemic, which actually started slightly before 2020 and ended well after 2020, but you know what I mean. I think you're probably better in touch with these feelings than, say, students before 2020. So I think this isn't a hard jump for you. But just imagine, and let's be conservatives, because these diseases came to America and from Europe at contact time in the 14 and 1500s. And contact time would be different for different indigenous groups. Contact time for people living in Massachusetts would have been the early 1500s. Contact time for the Arawaks in the Caribbean was 1492. Contact time for the Sioux living out in Minnesota and the Dakotas would have been much later. See what I mean? But so I'll just say contact. So imagine contact comes and it would kill 75 to 90% of people. But let's be conservative. Let's just say that we don't have any diseases here in California, and a disease comes to which we have no immunity, and 75% of us die. And very quickly. It would happen quickly. Remember the pandemic, how quickly that happened in a matter of months. Okay? So imagine like in January, you wake up in January, and you got this world, right? You got community college, and you have malls, and you have grocery stores, and you have Wi-Fi, and you have family, and you have an apartment, and you have freeways that mostly work, et cetera, et cetera. And then a pandemic hits, and 75% of the people you know and the people you don't know, 75% of everyone dies. Let's start with the feelings. How do you feel? You'd have a lot of feelings, but just think about that. This is a lot better in a classroom where you can shout these out. How would you feel? But we'd get a lot of stuff. I'd feel afraid. I'd feel confused. I'd feel guilty about surviving because if I'm having feelings, I'm clearly not dead. I'd feel sad. I'd feel depressed. I'd feel anxious. All the icky feelings, right? You can probably think of more. And then what are your real world problems? If 75% of everyone is dead, do you still go to the grocery store? Do you still go to In-N-Out to get a hamburger? I don't go to In-N-Out anymore because it turns out they have right-wing politics, and my theory is that every dollar I spend is a vote, and I just won't. I won't go to Chick-fil-A, and I won't go to In-N-Out. But let's say that you did, because you do you. But are you going to do that? Are you going to go to the grocery store to buy some basil for the pizza you're making tonight? I'm going to do that after this lecture. I'm going to go 20-mile drive to the grocery store because I live up in the mountains to buy basil because I need basil. I need basil for my pizza. Am I going to do that where 75% of people are dead? What am I going to do? I run on the wash machine. How long before my wash machine doesn't work because my electricity fails? That is, what are my physical problems? 75% of the dead means 75% of my teachers are dead, 75% of the grocery workers are dead, 75% of the restaurant workers are dead, 75% of the healthcare people are dead, 75% of the people who keep you moderately safe, the police. I'm not going to let's not overstate this, but they're dead. So 75% of the criminals are dead, but 25% are alive and living in a world where the brakes are off. Right? All those physical problems. It's what are the apocalypse shows? It's The Walking Dead without the zombies. I think I have some zombie jokes later. And then, so there's all of that happening. You have all these feelings and all of these real world problems. And so what are the questions you ask? And I think you ask a lot of little questions. Do I have to grow my own basil now? I guess I don't need to go to college because the world I'm going to live in now doesn't need me to know American history. It needs me to know how to grow basil. There's all the little questions. And then there's the big questions. And I think of all the big questions is the one there on the post-it note in the middle, which is why? Why did this happen? And I think in the next slide we answer that question. So I hate to overtalk it here. But we have some hints there. I have on the left, I have an angry female deity, and on the right, I have an angry male deity. And I think when we ask why did this happen? I think angry deities is going to play into the answer. Let's go see on the next slide, shall we? All right. I do this all the time. I talk through one slide and I get to the next slide and it's like, oh look, I already talked about that. So again, as I said, not the zombie apocalypse, but nonetheless, when you say apocalypse in 2024, the word zombie cannot be far away. So just for the fun of it, here's the feelings you'd feel, all those feelings, and maybe more. I think my students are really good at coming up with these feelings, and many of you are deeply in touch with them. You'd also, oh, this is the one I didn't say in the previous slide. You'd have sanitation problems. All those dead people would cause health problems. So you'd probably get what we know, and again, degree in microbiology, is you'd get the secondary deaths of all the stuff that poor sanitation causes. And that your food and water would be not as safe as it used to be. You'd have defense problems, healthcare problems. What do you do? I got a bad knee that needs an operation. In an apocalypse world, my knee doesn't get an operation. It's not broken. I'm just going to have to limp for the rest of my life. In short, it's the apocalypse. Maybe not the zombie apocalypse. And then you ask why? Why me? But really, mostly why me? I think we're going to ask why us when we're feeling good. But when we're feeling really shitty, what we all do, all of us human, because we're all narcissists in a crisis, is why me? Why did this happen to me? And again, in a classroom, I think I'd wait and you guys could throw some answers out. But I think a lot of these would come down to some higher power, some God, your God, a God, is angry with us. And I think even the atheists might come to that conclusion. I think it would be really hard not to imagine that in the depth of a crisis this deep and this powerful, that there'd be many people left who didn't think there was some sort of spiritual divine that was mad at us. And then you'd ask why? Why is the God, whoever your God is, angry with us? And then the answer would be because we were bad. Because gods don't get angry with you because you did the right things. And then you'd have different answers. If you're a Christian fundamentalist, you'd be like, because we let trans people read stories to small children. Or we let the women vote. And if you were a progressive liberal, you might say because we let social conservatives run amok and they took away women's reproductive freedom and couldn't quit being shitty to black people and brown people, and if et cetera, et cetera. You see what I mean? But fundamentally what you'd come up with is the God is angry with us because we were bad. And then depending on where you were situated with your personal belief systems, your definition of what was bad would vary. But the key here is, again, something is mad at us because we were bad. And here's the key to that. That's a loss of faith, not just in self, but in one's community. That it would be utterly psychologically devastating to begin to think everything that my group, my society was, Southern Californians, was bad, was wrong. The self-doubt and the questioning that would come from that, I can't even imagine it. But I think when you game this out, you get well past the sort of the physical problems of what do you do about food and what do you do about healthcare and do I have to do my homework? I think it gets really complicated about utter doubts about the society that you used to live in before the apocalypse. Yeah? Next slide. You want an example beyond your own imagining? Well, you probably didn't, but you're going to get one. Let's do Cortez and the Aztecs. Because here's a traditional story we all know. We all know. Again, imagine the rabbit ears, my fingers doing the rabbit ear thing around no. Because we don't know anything, but we think we know. So the traditional story is Cortez came to America with this small band of Spanish dudes, white dudes, and then with this relatively small band, Cortez defeated the mighty and powerful Aztec Empire, this big scary group of brown people. Moral of the story, small groups of white people so superior that they can defeat large groups of brown people. It's a story of white supremacy when you get down to it. And if you're thinking, I never thought of it that way, and Peg, you're seeing white supremacy everywhere, Okay, but stop and think about it for a second. Okay? It turns out that the real story is something very, very different from that. And that story about Cortez and a small group of Spanish dudes easily defeated a large group of brown dudes is literally a story created to tell white supremacist versions of history. And in reality, that story has nothing to do with, reality. What's the real story? It goes like this. First, Cortez takes off from Spain with some sailors and some boats. But at least one of the sailors on one of the boats has smallpox. Smallpox without a vaccine is between 50 and 90% deadly. It's a very gruesome disease. It's like 50% deadly amongst the Europeans who've got built up centuries and centuries of immunity to it because smallpox has been swirling around the New World for thousands of years. I mean, the Old World. It's been swirling around the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa. But there's no smallpox in the New World. So amongst the indigenous people, the smallpox is like 90% deadly. So there they are, sailing with the New World with smallpox on their ships. Next slide. I apologize for the gruesome nature of this picture, but I included it on purpose because I think it's easy to hear these things and for me to say, this is a really awful and deadly disease, and to not really see it. And when you see a very small child covered pox, those bumps, and clearly this is a child that is not going to survive this, which is pretty awful. And I wouldn't generally show those kinds of pictures because they're not cool, man. But again, I'm trying to impress upon you the severity of this disease. And it turns out that indigenous people, so Native Americans, and then a lot of Hispanic people, Latinos, are combinations of European blood and indigenous people. Those kinds of people remain more vulnerable, people with indigenous North American blood in them, more vulnerable to these New World diseases, these Old World diseases, I apologize. More vulnerable still. Tuberculosis rates, for example, on Indian reservations is way higher than amongst the general American population. Anyway, so smallpox is this super, super deadly disease. Cortez brings it to the New World, and it's going to kill, as you might imagine, a lot of indigenous people. Let's go see in the next slide. Okay, it says here's what happened at the top, and keep in mind that I'm doing this in one, huge generalizations and doing lots of complicated history in a very small part of time, and two, I'm kind of a natural smart aleck. But anyway, it goes kind of like this. The natives don't know they're about to die, and the natives are also, Cortez sails up on sort of the modern Yucatan coast. So if you think about the outline of Mexico, there is over there on the Caribbean side this sort of bump out. That's the Yucatan. And the people who live there, they've never seen Europeans before, and they're curious and fundamentally friendly people for whom hospitality is ingrained in their culture. So these strangers show up, and the natives are like, hey dudes, hi, nice to see you. Want some presents? Want to come see our houses? Want to eat some food? And Cortez, who's a European and a Christian with all of the sort of I am superior because I'm a man and I'm a white dude feelings in him, and they've learned the racism stuff from interacting with Asia and Africa, so they got this down. He's like, yeah, cool, I am a god to these people. He doesn't recognize they're being hospitable and friendly. He just thinks that they recognize what a superior being he is as a white man. Ooh, what a surprise. And he's like, ooh, look at me. And in those early interactions, Cortez's sailors, some of them have survived. Almost surely the original sailor who had smallpox on the ship is dead, but it's passed around the ship, so by the time they get to the Yucatan, there's still smallpox aboard. It comes aboard the Yucatan, and boom, there's disease. This same thing happened amongst the Arawak people where Columbus landed too, but we're doing the Cortez story. And so the natives get smallpox there on the Yucatan, and yeah, that sucks, and it spreads like wildfire. But here's the thing: nobody connects it with the Spanish conquerors, and if that seems stupid to you, keep in mind how disease works. Like when we first saw the coronavirus in California, we didn't see where that came from. And the only reason, imagine if you didn't have the news telling you where it came from, it just showed up. And you don't know. You have no idea. Um, and indeed, maybe the people when you get out, when Cortez and his dudes get off the boat, and those people get sick, they would almost surely have connected that. But that disease would have spread out in front of the Cortez and his crew, until people were getting, people from the first village would go to another village, who would go to another village. So people were getting smallpox 80, 100 miles away who'd never seen these Spanish dudes. Why would you connect the two events? You wouldn't. Um, so smallpox spreads way faster than Cortez moves um, 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 through Mexico, in part because Cortez is moving very slowly for a very specific reason. And to see that, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Okay. So the thing is, here's what Cortez knows, because he's heard it from the natives that he encounters. The people that he first meets when he gets off of the Yucatan, these are the Nahua people, N-A-H-U-A people. They are not the Aztecs, and indeed they are the enemy of the Aztecs. And what Cortez hears is, somewhere in the interior of this new land that is not yet called Mexico, there is this group of people who are immensely powerful, but immensely rich. They have lots and lots of gold. And indeed, it is true, the Aztecs had one of the most powerful and advanced cultures that has ever existed in the world. I think it's really easy to imagine people from a long time ago squatting in dirt in huts. I don't know, picking their toes. But the Aztec culture, like the Incan culture and the Mayan culture, oh, so technologically proficient and really, really what we might call advanced. I'm not crazy about that word, but nonetheless. They had irrigation, they had pyramids, they had advanced agriculture, they had the awesome war machine. They were super good at making war. And they had a very complicated government. They had a king in its head, but there were all these subdivisions of government. And they had a religion, and so with lots and lots of gods. It was a polytheistic religion, male gods and female gods, a religion so demanding that one of their gods, Huitzilopochtli, required a blood sacrifice, or so they thought. Because again, this is all belief, but belief can be real. Because if you believe it, again, I'm not saying it's science, but I'm saying it's real. That this god required daily sacrifice to make the sun come up. So the Aztecs often would make war for the purposes of taking prisoners so that they could sacrifice them to appease Huitzilopochtli. You can imagine this didn't make the Aztecs very popular with their neighbors. The Aztecs are this big, fearsome, scary group of people, and they're not very nice. These are not, or kumbaya, let's sing. These are not the people that Cortez ran into the coast who were like, hey man, let's share food and talk about our feelings. The Aztecs have this really awesome, powerful, violent culture. Their favorite sport is a sport they call the ball game. You can find some cool videos of it on YouTube. You should go look at it. It's kind of like basketball, but a game so brutal and so violent that the losers were often sacrificed. Like you lost the game and then you lost your life. I mean, that guy there with his guts being torn out in the picture probably failed to sink a three-pointer. Yeah. Anyway, wow, the Aztecs. So Cortez knows this, and he thinks, well, I want those people's gold, but to beat those people, I'm going to need more than just me and my Spanish sailors. So as he's moving his way inland toward the Aztec Empire, he is meeting with the heads of other villages to say, join me, and we will beat the Aztecs, and you will be rid of these god-awful people that steal your people and kill them. And some of those people are like, hey, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, so Cortez is my friend. Yeah? Next slide. I told you I do this all the time. There it is. So the Aztecs were super pro-war and super pro-conquest. It's not just white people who do this. So Cortez is like, well, I want to beat those people up because I want their riches. And a lot of the native people who aren't Aztecs are like, I don't like the Aztecs and I will help you. We got a map there sort of showing how he lands. He lands in the Yucatan, and then he sends some of his people back through Cuba. He sends other of his people, including himself, up through it. He's heading for the Aztec Empire. The capital of the Aztec Empire is Tenochtitlan. Present-day Mexico City essentially sits on the bones of Tenochtitlan. So that's where they're heading there, where the letters on the map say Aztec Empire. And then after they did that, they did some cruising up the coast and down the coast, looking for more riches. Anyway, Cortez, here's the thing. This is an interesting part of the story. There's still Hispanic culture, Latino culture has this tradition of this, of the Malinke or the Malincenists, is this sort of notion of like the reverse Pocahontas, whereas Pocahontas in American hagiography, folklore, is the Indian princess who is fantastic because she recognizes the superiority of white people and joins them, which is not what really happened, but nonetheless, that's the story we tell. That Melanson is the opposite of that, that she's this traitor to the Mexican people, keeping in mind there is no Mexican people because there's no Mexico yet. She's a traitor because she joins the Aztecs, and she joins the Spanish and helps them defeat the Aztecs. In reality, Melanson is when she's a 14-year-old girl. She was an Aztec girl who was kidnapped by some Nahua people. She ends up in the Yucatan. She's a slave. She's sold to Cortez when she's 14 years old. She now speaks the Aztec language, plus she speaks Nahua because she was kidnapped when she was little. So she speaks both languages. And then they have the Cortez has amongst his men a man who'd been to the Yucatan before and had learned Nahua on a trip a few years before. So he's got a guy who speaks Nahua, and then he's got this 14-year-old slave girl who has no choice in the matter. The stories about her are dreadfully unfair. What a surprise. She's a woman. So she's got a guy who can speak Spanish and Nahua, and then Melanson who can speak Nahua and Aztec. So as they march inland towards Tenochtitlan, in the Aztec Empire's heart, Melanson is their translator, and Cortez gets thousands and thousands of native people to join him. Now, keeping in mind that the whole time this is happening, smallpox has already swept through these villages. By the time Cortez gets to these villages, if you look at that map along that route through the up around the Yucatan, smallpox has already got there and decimated population. So the people that remain alive are pretty anxious, and I'm more inclined to blame the Aztecs for their misfortunes because the Aztecs are this long-held enemy than they are these newly appeared Spanish. And the people who haven't died of smallpox are happy to join Cortez to march on the Aztecs, who they blame for their misfortune. Smallpox has also gotten to Tenochtitlan, and Moctezuma, the king of the Aztec Empire at that time, is standing over the ruins of a society in which 90% of his people have died, with all of the things that we talked about. So let's go look at the next slide, shall we? Let's see how much of the stuff I've already said. Yeah, next slide. All right, so Cortez gets to Tenochtitlan. It's not just him and a small band of Spanish dudes. It's him, a small band of Spanish dudes, and a massive thousands of Nahua, that is native Mexico, for lack of a better word, native people who are helping Cortez with the Aztecs. There's that reality on one side, and on the other side is by the time they get to Tenochtitlan, it has already been ravaged by smallpox. And there is Moctezuma. He is the leader, the king of a city, a vast, powerful city that had done all of the sacrifices they thought were the right thing, and still something like 75 to 90% of his people were dead. And we know this for a fact. This isn't just guessing. They're dead. His entire society has collapsed. And then Cortez shows up with the angry neighbors. And historians are always like, I don't know why Moctezuma didn't fight. Why didn't he fight back? Why did he so easily capitulate to the Spanish? And of course, the moral of the story is he immediately recognized the Spanish were superior. No! He was presiding over a culture that had just collapsed. And a whole bunch of angry people showed up at his door. What's he going to do? 75 to 90% of his army is dead. 75% of his people making food are dead. 75 to 90% of his family are dead, including his kids. Um, 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 there's also this sort of thing. Moctezuma thought Cortez was a god, and he was confused by seeing men on horses and thought he was a god. No, he wasn't. If you'd never seen a horse before and you saw somebody on a horse and then they got off the horse, you wouldn't think, wow, that's a god. You'd think, that's a person riding an animal I've never seen before. That's what you'd think. Here's the thing. The people in the past weren't dumber than you. And the people in the past who were brown weren't dumber than you, right? So it's not any of those things. Moctezuma surrenders almost immediately because, one, there's a large angry army outside his gates, and two, his society has just experienced the apocalypse, right? So we got those two things. So the new moral of the story is the Spanish don't win because they're superior. They win because, one, they got lucky with the smallpox. And I don't mean to be flippant about that, but that's what it is. And two, the Aztecs had been so douchey for so long that there were lots and lots of native people willing to help Cortez defeat the Spanish. Keeping in mind those people were also dying, and because they didn't connect that with the Spanish for good reasons, they were particularly angry. They would have attached that to the Aztecs. So two things again. Disease in Tenochtitlan, large angry horde, in part angry because of the way the Aztecs had behaved for hundreds of years, in part angry because they're being blamed for this pandemic. Those two things collide. The Aztec empire collapses. Cortez easily wins. He doesn't win because he's superior. He wins because the natives are vulnerable to disease, and the Aztecs are vulnerable to conquest because they've been so shitty to their neighbors. They're the us, the United States of America, of them. Yeah. All right, let's look at the next slide. Okay, here we go. We got just a couple of things and we're done. We're summing up. What have we learned? Winners don't win history. History isn't won. History is life, and life is not sports. One of the reasons we like sports is because sports are fair, usually, unless someone's cheating, and sports have this clean, somebody won and somebody lost. Yeah, and that's why we watch sports. If sports were like life, we wouldn't need sports. Life isn't sports. Life isn't fair, and people who win don't win because they're better. Even if it was in life that that life was fair, winners don't win because they're superior. Because it's not sport. Oh, it says all that. History is life. Okay, we did all that. 1 and 2 were there. Life isn't sport. Life isn't fair. Sports are fair. Life is unfair. Oh, we've done 1, 2, 3. Okay? Again, history isn't sports. History isn't a football game, a soccer game, a cycling race, a tennis match. Isn't any of those things. So a Euro-American, here's the thing about the Cortez and Aztec story. That is one story about one place and one historical moment. But that story played out over North and Latin America over and over and over again. Europeans showed up, disease showed up with them or in front of them. Native American populations were decimated. Europeans had a hole in the house to step through, if you know what I mean, from the disease collapse. So here's the thing. European Americans would have won the conquest no matter what because of their disease advantage. Yeah, these diseases killed them, but not at the same rate it killed the native people. Even if the Europeans had shown up and been like, hey man, let's sing Kumbaya and talk about our cultural differences and figure out a way to live together. Even if they'd have done that, and they didn't, but even if they had, Native Americans still would have died in huge, huge numbers. Their cultures still would have been disrupted. I'm not saying it's okay. I'm not saying they had it coming. I'm not even saying it's inevitable. I am just saying once the European Americans showed up, then it was kind of inevitable. Yeah, because of they lived in a disease-free paradise until the people-covered disease showed up. Yeah. Okay. One more summing up slide, and then we can call it a day. Yeah? Good job. Let's go. Okay, so final thoughts on this, our first serious American history lecture. Again, do not think for one moment that Peg is engaged in some culturally conservative historical exercise where she's excusing colonialism, imperialism, and the violence of Euro-Americans against Native Americans. I am not doing that. All the violence was real, and it was all bad. Colonialism is bad, imperialism is bad. But it's super important that we're clear about the disease mortality issue, because in doing so, we can be clear about why things came out the way they did. They didn't come out the way they did because violence and imperialism and patriarchy and monotheistic Christianities are better than all the Native American systems. It's not because of that. It's because of the disease mortality. And it's the thing we don't talk about much in history. Maybe because it's true and it doesn't fit the white supremacist function of American history. Right? So again, there's no excuse for racism or sexism in colonial imperialist stuff. Um, what's important is the disease problem, though, and understanding that, and understanding that when the Native Americans lost, it wasn't because they were inferior, except unless you want to say, well, they're inferior because they didn't have disease immunity. But that's a pretty stupid argument, and not an argument I would imagine most of you would want to entertain, that people who die of disease are inferior. That seems like a morally unacceptable argument to all but the most conservative Americans. I know some people made that argument during the pandemic, but nobody decent, right? So again, what we end up with is that European Americans, white or white-ish Americans, don't end up in charge of North America because they're better, or because their religion is better, or because their gender arrangements are better. They end up in charge because they're less vulnerable to disease. Historical winners don't win because they're smarter and better and righter and have a better God. They win for all sorts of complicated reasons. And in the case of this one, it's mostly about disease mortality. Yeah? Yeah. I know. It's depressing. Welcome to American history. There's not always a lot of good news. But it is interesting, and I think it's empowering. Because what we have had here is a lesson about the ways in which, because these sort of morality lessons that we tell in American history about indigenous people and the triumph of colonial European Americans is fundamentally stories that says you can't fight the man. And that's not true. You can fight the man because the man, whoever the man is, rich white dudes, and the systems that support them, because it's not really the individual white dudes. They're the disease. They're the symptoms of a larger disease, that disease that is patriarchy and capitalism run amok, right? You can fight that because you don't belong to an inferior group. That's the good news, huh? Yeah? Okay. One last thing. One last slide, but you're done taking notes. Okay, so end of our first lecture. You were taking notes along the way, either by hand or in some electronic form. You're going to upload those to Canvas. You also have the other assignments to do in Canvas. All of the homework gets uploaded to Canvas. If you're in an in-person class, you need to come to class. If you're in an online class, you need to finish your homework on time so that you can get to next week's work on time. I use these lectures for both the in-person and online classes, so I can't give just one set of instructions. But there you are. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I kept it as verbally tight as I can. I like to stop and tell stories, but nonetheless, try to keep it moving. If you have any questions, as always, genuinely, email me. Do not feel like you need to preface the email with, I'm sorry to bother you, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you. It is my job, my dudes. I am getting paid to help you. And also, I'm a nice person, and I want to help you. I take teaching seriously, and you teach students by helping them when they need help. Yeah? Okay. And if you don't have a question, that's cool too. Yeah? Okay. I think that sums it up. I will see you a week from now in the next lecture, right? Good job, you guys. Go out there and be good humans. Bye.